Media.
Hi, Campside listeners. This is Inside the Tent, the show where we go behind the mic and hear from the people who made our latest podcasts. I'm Shoshi Shmulevitz. I'm a producer and editor at Campside Media, and I'm here with Delaney Hall, who's the host of Service Request. That's our newest podcast, and it's a co-production with the brilliant folks at 99% Invisible, where Delaney is also a senior editor. For more exclusive content and behind-the-scenes anecdotes from our shows, visit joincampside.com. Delaney, thank you for joining me today.
Oh, thanks, Shoshi. I'm happy to be here.
So, Service Request is a show about infrastructure, but I think it's a particularly fun show about infrastructure. Can you talk a little bit about the format? Like, how did you come up with it?
Sure. So the way this show started is that you guys at Campside came to us at 99PI and said, we'd really like to do a show about infrastructure, which is something that we cover on and off at 99PI, but not in a totally dedicated way. So I was excited to do a story that was like about how these systems actually work, sort of more about the details and mechanics. And so we started talking about what should we cover in the first 5 episodes. And we kind of stumbled on this idea of starting with a question from a listener or from someone on staff at 99PI who had an experience that kind of led them to wonder about infrastructure in their lives. So that's been a really fun element of the format because it just creates this like motivating momentum for figuring out how things work. So for example, in our 311 episode, our first episode, my colleague Christopher Johnson had this really frustrating experience when he was living in Manhattan where these Mr. Softy ice cream trucks were constantly coming around, driving around the neighborhood, playing their jingles, parking and letting their jingles run over and over and over again while they waited for kids. And he got so frustrated with just like the noise pollution of Mr. Softy that he decided to call 311 to complain and to see if there was something the city could do about it. And then that experience kind of leads us into, well, how did 311 in New York start? How do they organize all the information they might need to share about the way the city works? Who are the operators who answer those calls and how do they do their job? And so the format has ended up being like a question from a listener sort of leads us into this system and we dissect how it works.
So 311, when someone says infrastructure, that's not the first thing that generally is going to pop into your head.
Totally.
I mean, it's a phone service.
Right.
And it's pretty unexpected. I mean, you think like roads, bridges, which are not what any of those first 5 episodes are about. But
yeah.
So for the purposes of this show, what is infrastructure?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think we're taking a pretty broad view of infrastructure. So the first few episodes are about, 311, but we also did an episode about trash cans. We did an episode about traffic lights. We did an episode about the grid. And so I think the first 5 episodes are a mix of systems that are more expected and then a couple that are a little more like offbeat. And the way I think of it is mostly like, what are the systems that are kind of humming in the background of our everyday lives that we rarely think much about? We might rely on them. We might rely on them really heavily, like the grid, for instance. But unless something goes wrong with that infrastructure, it's just such background to our lives that we never stop to question how it works and what it's doing.
Yeah, I remember a few years ago when Congress was working on this big infrastructure bill, and there was this big controversy around childcare. Like
Yes.
childcare is not infrastructure.
Totally.
I feel like maybe also one layer of it is it's just any kind of public service or thing that contributes to the public good.
Yeah.
Right?
I think that's a great way of thinking about it. Yeah. And I think one thing that we're doing with this show is revealing how these systems are also very human. One of my favorite things about this show so far is talking to the people who work within these systems. So a 311 operator, for instance, or a tow truck driver. So I think it's expanding our sense of infrastructure to be human as well as sort of physical. I think that's a cool part of the show as well. And yeah, I think there's a great case to be made for childcare being a kind of infrastructure. It's like these systems that kind of underlie the everyday functioning of the world.
Have you always been interested in infrastructure? Like, how did you end up here? Making a show about things like traffic lights and trash bins.
It's so funny because I've been working at 99PI for 10 years, and it's a show that is about architecture, design, urbanism, infrastructure, the sort of built world. Like many people on our staff, I don't actually think I came to the show with a very specific interest in those topics.
I think that's one reason why the show is so good.
That's probably true. Yeah. Like, I think if we were all hardcore architecture nerds, we wouldn't be as good at translating those stories to a popular audience. So I guess the answer is like, no, I haven't always been interested in infrastructure, but I do really like the lens that 99PI brings to the world, which is that the ordinary world is really interesting when you start peeling back the layers of how it works and how it was made. That has been, I think, what's kept me at the show for a really long time, and it's kind of a way of looking at the world that I really appreciate and kind of bring to my life now, in addition to my reporting.
Yeah, I think one of the really fun things about this show is that it's full of these quirky little facts.
Yeah.
What's like the best or weirdest thing you learned working on Service Request?
Well, there's a detail from the 311 episode that's really stayed with me, where we were talking with the guy who's overseen 311 for the city of New York for the past 20 years. And he was talking about how they plan for big events that they know are coming. It could be a blizzard or a hurricane or just something is about to happen. They know they're going to get a lot of calls and questions from the public, and they're trying their best to sort of prep for that event, whatever it might be. And he talked about this phrase that they use in those planning meetings where they talk about trying to remember the floating luggage. And that term is basically their term for expect the unexpected. And it came out of this event in New York, the so-called Miracle on the Hudson, where there was a plane taking off from LaGuardia and it ran into a bunch of birds and it crash landed. It had to ditch into the Hudson. And it was this highly publicized event in New York. And of course, 311 was getting a ton of calls. And they were doing their best to answer them. But the call that they didn't anticipate was people calling to say, like, how do I retrieve my luggage that basically, like, exploded out into the Hudson River when the plane crashed? Or some people were calling and saying, I found luggage, like, washed up on the shore of the Hudson. Like, what do I do with it? And so this was this question they got that, like, they had not anticipated getting.
I mean, who would?
I know. So they came up with this term, floating luggage, that they now sort of years past that specific event, that's their term for, like, what's the floating luggage in this situation going to be? Like, what is the unanticipated thing that we can try to think ahead and anticipate? And I don't know. I just loved that. Like, I love sort of learning about people's work within these systems and how they do what they do and how they think about what they do. And that's one little quirky detail that I find myself thinking about a lot after that interview happened.
The floating luggage. I'm just imagining you like, I don't know, getting ready for a trip or taking the kids out and thinking, Delany, remember the floating luggage.
100%.
Preparing for any scenario.
Yes. It's a good way of sort of prompting yourself to think ahead. What am I missing here?
I love that. I think about that one also.
Yes. It's
a good
useful.
life lesson.
Yes, it is.
Any other sort of big takeaways that you've learned from this show, from making this show, about infrastructure, about the way we interact with it?
I think one thing I appreciate doing these interviews for the show is just how underappreciated maintenance is. And that maintenance is really like what makes the world go round. Just the everyday care for these systems and work inside these systems. And that it's not very visible work. I feel like it's work that we often don't celebrate or think about much, but that it's so critical. And I think that's something I'm taking away from the show. It's just like the power of maintenance.
Yeah, that's a big one, especially thinking about like the grid, for example, and how it's falling apart in lots of places.
Yeah. We talked to someone for the grid episode who works for a utility in Phoenix, and the question driving that episode was just how does the city prepare for summer in Phoenix when there's going to be a huge demand on the grid because everybody's trying to cool their homes and businesses. And the work of the people who maintain the grid is very bureaucratic. It's deeply operational. There's like all these layers and teams working on this element, that element of it. And it's kind of hard to describe, and it's honestly a little bit boring, but it's so, so important. And sort of the stakes are very existential. And so there's something kind of cool about that, like celebrating this work that doesn't often get talked about, but that's really fundamental to the way things run.
The boring stuff that makes our lives possible.
Yes.
Which makes it interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah, it does. I think that's what I'm saying about the kind of 99 PI lens we're bringing to this is like, it's almost like anything you look at, if you look closely enough, is very interesting.
Yeah. So at the time of this recording, we have a couple of episodes out in the world. And already you've gotten some feedback and you've gotten some new service requests.
Yes, right.
What are some of the questions that people have sent in that you're excited to dive into for future episodes?
Yeah. So this is part of the show that we're really excited about is, each episode is guided by a question that comes to us. And the first batch of questions really came from colleagues, but now that the show is out in the world, we're getting a lot of questions from listeners. And let's see, people are curious about how Wi-Fi works, how snow removal works, and why it's really good in some places and totally sucks in others. People have written in curious about toll roads, elevators. Let's see. We've also gotten questions about that are very specific to certain places. Like someone wrote in and said, what are we going to do about the Pacific Coast Highway, which is falling into the ocean? Someone wrote in from New Orleans with questions about their water system and the consequences of pumping and land subsidence. Someone wrote in about the miracle that is global air travel and how complicated it is to schedule and reschedule and coordinate all of these airplanes flying around the world to thousands of airports. So we're getting lots of great questions from listeners, and we're hoping that the next episodes can really be guided by some of those questions.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that people are getting excited about this. I feel like we're not in the era of great public works
right
now.
Yeah.
We're in the era of crumbling public works. So I think that there's a beautiful lesson in this show that sort of reminds us these are things that we all depend on. These are things that everybody relies on, the grid, the public trash cans, you know, from these sort of big things to small things. And I don't know, maybe there's some good vibes we're sending out into the world with this show.
Yeah, no, I think it is really important to remember the importance of public infrastructure and that we do rely on it. And it is bad when these things fail. And so, you know, some of the questions we've gotten are really positive ones, like why does this work so well? And then some of the questions we're getting are more anxious, like we have really old bridges in this country and they're vulnerable to falling apart. And what's the plan for fixing them? You know, so I think we're doing both things on the show, looking at how marvelous it is when things really work well, and then gesturing a little bit to like, yikes, this system is teetering on the brink of collapse, and what are the consequences of that? But yeah, I hope the show is largely good vibes and like a celebration of infrastructure and why it matters.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Delany.
Absolutely. Thank you, Shoshi. And it's been so fun to work on this show with you. I hope people will listen.
You can listen to Service Request wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much to Delaney, 99% Invisible, and the rest of the Service Request team. And thank you for listening to Inside the Tent. If you haven't already, don't forget to go to joincampside.com to become a free member of the Campside community. That's joincampside.com.